Well, as we commemorate Africa Month, let's look at the issue of language. Many researchers in this field believe it is vital to the continent's decolonial project. This Africa Month, SA Research Chair's initiative in the Intellectualisation of African Languages, Professor Dion Nkomo, explores the research into promoting indigenous languages in academic settings and publications. Well, he joins us now to tell us more about the interdisciplinary research that will go into achieving just this. Well, Professor Nkomo, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for joining us on the Weekend Report. Well, it's been close to 40 years since the Language Action Plan was adopted by the African Union. Have we made strides since then, would you say?
Greetings, Dogozo, and greetings to Weekend Report viewers. Thanks for the question. I think it's a pertinent one. Language is indeed an important issue for Africa, given that language played a critical role in the colonization of the continent. And whatever we're trying to achieve now as part of the decolonial project certainly has to put language at the center. So looking at whether or not we've made strides, I think it's not a black and white situation. There's been progress, especially if we look at countries like South Africa, which have adopted multilingual language policies, which value African languages and commit to their promotion as languages of the academia, as languages that can be used in other powerful socio-economic and political domains. However, there are countries which have not even made any progress, whereby the language question was totally avoided when colonialism ended. However, even when we look at South African context where we have language policies, we realize that there is a long way that still need to be achieved for African languages in particular to be respected the same way as English. So that's why I'm saying it's not a case of black and white when we look at the strides, but there's definitely been some progress.
Right. You know, we've seen pushback, certainly when it comes to economic policy, when it comes to social policies, pushback against this concept of neo-colonialism, this reimposition of imperialist rule. And I wonder, when it comes to the language context, where do we still see aspects of an almost neo-colonial impression, where indigenous languages are really struggling to come to the front and center? You know, we mentioned in the introduction to the front and center of research and publications, but you know, we see it even at a primary sort of foundational school level, where there is a real concerted effort to support the resurgence of indigenous languages. Is there enough of a pushback on that front, would you say?
We have a serious challenge when it comes to language policies compared to other policies. Where the problem started was the fact that upon the attainment of independence in most African countries, the language issue wasn't seen as a priority, just like in the other sectors, like the provision of health, education, and so on. So African governments did not invest sufficiently when it came to addressing the language question. But even in context like South Africa, where we have a multilingual language policy paying premium to the importance of African languages and multilingualism, the sad reality is that colonialism neglected African languages and even led to Africans themselves not having confidence in their languages. Even if you inform parents now that their children have rights to learn in their own languages, which is actually an important undertaking given, for example, the recent PERS results that shows that South Africa is underperforming. it will still be parents who are not confident, who are not willing to have their children learn their own languages. Of course, there is a reason there. The fact is that African languages are not equal and fair options when you compare them to languages such as English and French. So when people look at the prospects of social mobility, they would rather be inclined to choose the ex-colonial languages.
Right. And the strange thing, Prof, is the fact that this is a constitutionally enshrined right, the protection of indigenous languages in this country, the use thereof, are rights that are protected. And so it is a curious thing to find that this is a struggle that we still face today. It seems that having the legal framework is not enough on its own.
It is definitely not enough. The challenge that you get with policies that are passed as matters of law and compliance is that the people who are responsible for implementation will do the bare minimum to comply. For example, I'll look at the language question in higher education. In 2002, the language policy for higher education was adopted, and one of the key provisions or imperatives was for universities to develop their own institutional language policies within which they would identify specific African languages and commit to developing them as fully fledged languages. So when we look at the issue of compliance, it's about ticking boxes. Do we have a language policy as a university? Yes, we'll tick the box. Does that policy identify specific African languages which the university commits to develop into academic languages? And we'll tick the boxes. But then, if it is more than compliance, if we appreciate that it is actually a social justice issue, if we accept that it is a case of transformation, a case of empowerment, we will, instead of focusing on the policies themselves, we'll look at the practices that obtain in our spaces. And those policies or the campaigns should rather force us or encourage us to see the reality of our practices being transformed instead of just looking at the bare minimums. So what we have is actually a case of compliance without sufficient commitment to real change.
Right. Now, I don't know if South Africa or Africa is at a linguistic crisis point. I'm not sure, but I know that oftentimes we do find Africans, South Africans thinking in English or in Francophone areas thinking in French and having to translate into their indigenous languages. And I think that is the essence of what we've lost when we have these kinds of conversations. What are the interventions, Prof, that we can put in place now, in the short term, in the medium term, that will eventually produce results that bring us closer to that language action plan?
Well, the interventions that we can put in place, in fact, interventions already exist, especially in the higher education sector. Universities are busy developing resources in African languages because one of the major challenges thus far has been the fact that it is difficult to use African languages for teaching and learning, because there are no resources that students may use in order to learn through those languages. Of course, there are institutions like PANSAP. More work needs to be done there. And of course, the Department of Arts, Sports, Culture and Recreation, which has been developing terminologies for use in schools and even in various government departments, such as the Department of Health.
Right.
However,
Prof, unfortunately, I do have to interrupt you there. We have run out of time for our conversation. So unfortunate. But thank you so much for joining us. That is Prof. Dion Nkomo.